and looking forward to it. Looking forward to doing a good review of the briefs and estimates section. And you'll notice here that I have an agenda up. It's pretty simple. We're going to be going through the creation of a brief, of course. We're looking at creating a brief from scratch, creating a brief from an existing estimates. We're going to be then going through the creation of estimates, creating an estimate from scratch, from a template, looking at the tracking and management of revisions. We're also going to be looking at the creation of revenue schedules and talking a bit about how that relates to reporting. And on the topic of reporting, we'll then go into looking at the searchability and reporting on your submitted estimates and submitted briefs. And I'll also touch a little bit on the forecast report itself, because that does tie into, of course, the revenue schedule, which we'll be reviewing today. And then towards the end of the session, I'm going to touch briefly on the creation of the estimate and brief templates. So how the brief templates are actually created in the back end of the system, and also how you can create templates for your estimates. And I'll be reviewing that. It's pretty simple, so we'll probably take the last few minutes to review the creation of those templates. Great. I should mention I do have a little bit of a cough today, so if I do apologize if I happen to mute my phone just to clear my throat there, but you may hear me do it once or twice. And great. So the primary goal for today is to do a thorough review of the creation of briefs and estimates, and also answer any questions that do come up. So please, if you do have any questions, use the question module in the GoToWebinar, and we'll most likely be coming back to the questions towards the end of the session. I believe that Leonardo is going to be answering some, any that he can get to during the webinar, but I believe that most or many will be saved till the end so we can, review them in a bit more detail. Great. Well, without further ado, let's get started. Here we are. So right now we're looking at an example system, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be starting off with the creation of a brief. And one thing I'll mention is that some of our clients have different terminology. So the section that we're looking at here that's called briefs, it may be called something differently in your system. It may be called opportunities, it may be called requests. You could be using a completely different term. So just keep that in mind. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a brief from scratch. And you'll notice the find, the view, and the add. I'm just going to simply select Add Brief. One thing I'll mention is that you can add a brief from a company details page. So if you happen to be looking at a client, you can select Add Brief from their details page as well. I'm going to call this webinar brochure. Might want to spell that correctly. We'll then select our brief type. Now, the selection of the brief type is going to control which fields you see on the next page. The brief types typically match up to your job types, and having a brief type for each job type may not be necessary if your briefs aren't as detailed, but they will typically match up to the job type if you're providing more information. I'm going to stick with a brochure for today. But the selection of the brief type is going to control which fields we see on the next page. It's also going to control the account executive that is selected for the brief. We'll then select our company. I'm going to enter this for a company called North Shore Auto Group. And we'll select our contact at that company. We can then enter a budget. The budget is really just for reference. The dollar figure doesn't actually pull into your estimate. It's just a dollar figure that you're able to reference and look at while creating your estimate. Let's say that it's going to be maybe $12,500. We can enter our delivery date. Let's say this is going to be due on the 21st of December. You, of course, can select from the calendar if you prefer. You'll notice then that we have an estimate field, and this is asking if you'd like to relate this brief to an existing estimate in the system. In this case, we're creating from scratch, so we'll leave that blank. Compensation is looking at how you are actually going to be billing for this job. Are you working on a time and materials basis, is it a retainer, or a fixed price project? We then have our overall description, and this will carry into the estimate that we create afterwards as well. One thing I'll mention is that if you're using a modern version of any browser, you can always expand these description fields by selecting the corner and dragging them down. I'll click Save and Next, and that brings us into the brief section itself. Now, this is a brief that I've put together for today's session, and the questions and information that you're seeing here have been controlled by the brief type that we selected. Towards the end of the webinar, when we go into the creation of templates, you'll see a bit more about how we create these fields. But really, the possibilities are endless. You can create really any kind of question that you might like, and the types are very flexible. It could be a large text area, as you see here. It could have a title and a description, or just a title. If it's a required field, it's yellow, so we must enter data here. And again, if you are using a modern version of any browser, you can, again, expand these text areas to be as large as you wish. Now, this particular brief has 2 pages. So on the first page, you're seeing some radio buttons, some checkboxes. The difference being checkboxes allow you to select multiple options, whereas a radio button allows you to select just a single option. Another large text field that is not required. And if we click Save and Next, we'll move into the next page. Here are some examples of some more radio buttons, checkboxes, drop-downs for viewing a single option at a time. Another thing that we can do in the briefs is upload files. Now, there is some neat drag and drop functionality throughout the system, but unfortunately in the brief section, you do actually need to map the file, which simply means that you're selecting Choose File and you're choosing it from wherever it may sit on your computer. Now, you can upload an unlimited amount of files into the briefs, but you do need to have a file location for each file that you're choosing, which means that your list of these type of fields, upload file, might be quite long. For that reason, I recommend using the ability to duplicate the next field. What this allows you to do is simply duplicate the file upload field to have as many as you wish, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we'll take a look at how this is created a bit more in the template section. But I'll click Save and Next, and that will bring us to the brief details page. So a couple of things to mention. The creation of the brief for a lot of our clients is a really important stage where vital information is gathered. The information is then available from the job details page, and you'll always be able to reference that data. And it's important to speak to your staff about really providing as much information as they possibly can. If you're not able to provide information and the fields are not required, you can always come back to the brief later and fill out the data as you receive it. But the more information that your staff are putting into the briefs, the better and more accurate your estimate will be, and the easier it will be for them to pull up and reference that information when the job or the project is ongoing. So that's really the creation of the brief from scratch. We filled in all of the top details manually. We filled in the client name, the contact, the type. We filled in all this details as we created this particular item. I'm going to come back to this in just a bit. But one thing I want to show really quickly is the creation of a brief from an estimate. A lot of times the workflow may be reversed. You may have an estimate that's created, and you then want to go ahead and add a brief for it. If that's the case, let's take a look at an estimate here. I have an estimate here called NA Winter Brochure. You'll notice that I've selected it. We're now looking at the estimate details page. The estimate details page possesses a lot of the information that the brief provides, or vice versa. So when we look at the estimate name, that will become the brief name. When we look at the estimate type, that will become the brief type. So if we're looking at a brief details page, or sorry, my apologies, if we're looking at an estimate details page, and this estimate does not have a brief, up at the top in our action buttons, you'll have a button that says Add Brief. If you do have a brief, this button will say Brief Details and allow you to navigate to the brief. From the estimate, selecting Add Brief will bring us to our brief add page, but you'll notice that a lot of the information is filled in for us. The name, the type, the company name, contact, description, and so on. We may want to fill in, say, the budget and the compensation. Click Save and Next, and that will again bring us into our questionnaire. So no matter which order you do things, the information that you provide is going to be carried over. If you're creating a brief first and then creating an estimate, the information will be carried into the estimate. If you're creating an estimate first and then going on and creating the brief afterwards, the information will then flow into the brief. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at creating an estimate from the first brief that we've created. So let's navigate back to that. I'm going to go back to our webinar brochure simply by hovering over briefs, hovering over view. We've looked at it recently, so it's towards the top. Select our webinar brochure, and that brings us back to the details page for our webinar brochure for our client, North Shore Auto Group. Now, the process that we looked at earlier, where we had an existing estimate, and then we then created a brief from that estimate, again, is very similar in the opposite direction. We now have a brief that we're looking at with the information that we provided. Notice that this brief does have 2 pages, so you are able to navigate and look at the different pages. And then up at the top, in our action buttons, we have a button that says Add Estimate. Again, if the estimate did exist, you'd see a button that said Estimate Details that would allow you to navigate to the existing estimate. One thing I'll mention quickly before I do that is that the printing of the brief it has some different options. We can print off an overview of the entire brief. That's going to provide every single question and the information that was provided in those questions. You can also print off each page individually. So if, say, page 1 was it was information provided by the client, and page 2 is information provided internally, you can print those off separately to provide in different meetings. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select to add an estimate. Select Add Estimate, and that brings us to our Estimate Add page. And you'll notice that any information that was provided in the brief has now been brought over. Name, type, company contact, and so on. We can then add in any information that doesn't already exist. So say, for example, a client PO number, and also a month close and a close probability. There's a couple different ways of reporting on potential work that may be coming down the pipeline. And one of the ways that's really simple and easy is entering a month close and a close probability. And that is choosing the month that you expect this estimate to be approved and turned into an active project, and the probability that you expect it to close. Now, this close probability field is asking for a percentage, and the percentage is entered as a decimal. I do recommend telling your staff to keep this very standardized so as to improve your searchability. If staff are entering 37% to close, it's going to be more difficult to accurately search and report on this information. So typically it's either 25, 50, 75, or maybe if you want to have a 95 category to basically say, this is definitely going to be an active job at some point. But what this is going to allow us to do, which we're going to look at a little bit later, is do a search for existing estimates that may be submitted within a certain month to close that have a certain probability of closing, and allow us to then report on that information. You can do a search based on a certain account executive or a certain type of job, and get a really nice report on what kind of dollar figures are you expecting in the next coming months. And we'll look at some more robust revenue forecasting functionality in just a bit as well. But at this point, I'm going to be selecting the phases and services that we're going to be working on. And of course, the phases and services that you're seeing here are simply examples in my system and are different terminology than your own. But I'm going to choose a couple examples here. I'm going to say we're going to be working on specification and concept phase. We'll be doing some research, maybe some documentation, maybe some sketches and roughs, and we'll be providing our client with some color proofs. We're also going to be working on some design and production. We're going to be doing some design work, some production. We're going to be doing some copywriting. We're also going to have some client management. And we're also going to be purchasing some printing for our brochures. Click Submit. And that brings us to our Estimate Details page. In this details page, like the others, will provide all the information up above, either entered from scratch or provided through the brief, and relating information below, including our phase and service structure, and also our revenue schedule, which we'll be looking at in just a bit. Creation of the estimate is flexible. There's different ways to enter in your values. One thing I'll mention is that the phase and the service structure is going to pull in based on what we selected on the previous page, but it can be renamed. I can call this previous project research. Because you can right-click on your spelling mistakes, it's always very, very handy for myself. Description space is unlimited, and again, you can expand these fields by selecting from the drop-down. We've actually made an adjustment recently where we've shrunken the phase description field so as to include more information on the page. That being said, putting your cursor into the field automatically expands it, and you can then expand it further if you should wish to do so. The values that we enter here are flexible. The rate dollar figure here is filled in based on the rate category that we selected. We can enter in our hours or our overrides. You might say we're going to work on previous project research for 5 hours. Calculates for us. Documentation. Let's say that we want to track internally that we're going to have a budget of 5 hours to enter against documentation, but we're going to charge our client $1,000. The override field is good for entering in a dollar value. You may or may not have hours, but one of the benefits of including hours is that it allows you to track internally what you expected this particular task or service to take while charging your client a different value, more or less if you're maybe providing a discount. Let's say maybe another 15 hours of sketches or roughs. And then I have my example of color proofs. An internal expense tracked at a number of units. Of course, your internal expenses have a solidified rate structure, and therefore they can't actually be renamed based on how they're reported in the system. But let's say we're providing our client with maybe 5 color proofs. Now let's say that we want to go into more detail. This is especially, what I'm about to show you right now is especially handy if you have different billing rates for different staff. If the rate structure of your organization is controlled by the staff person that's doing the work, then you may want to provide more detail when you're creating the estimate so as to more, better accurately estimate each service. Let's say for design, we know who's going to be doing the work and they have different billing rates. We want to use those rates to create our estimate. What I might do is click on the plus icon at the service level. Selecting the plus icon at the service level is going to allow me to select a specific staff or role. Selecting a staff person will enter in the staff person's billing rate. If the billing rates differ by staff, then that will fill in automatically. Now you may not actually know who's going to be doing this work. Now this design portion, we're not really sure which staff person is going to be doing this. We may have to look at their availability when the schedule is created, perhaps maybe after the estimate is approved. But we do know what role level is going to be doing the work. Perhaps it's going to be a senior designer. Selecting the role level can also control the billing rate. That allows you to use the different rates you have for different staff people, but not actually have to select a specific staff person at this stage. We could say the senior designer is going to put in 10 hours. Let's say the studio technician is going to put in 25. And again, our values calculate automatically. You can also enter in date information. This will flow into your schedule. So if you are creating a schedule or a timeline, any dates that you provide here will flow into that schedule. So it's optional. If you want to include date information on the estimate, then you can. Let's put in a few more values here. And let's say we'll put in another 20 hours for production, maybe another 15 for copywriting, and then client management. Let's say that we're going to put in another 5 hours. Now, if we're looking at this, we're thinking, hey, we've forgotten something. We needed an extra service in here that we didn't select on the previous page, or maybe it wasn't a part of this particular phase's template. We want to go ahead and select an item that's not existing right now. Up at the top, at the phase level, you'll notice there's some different options. Deleting the phase, adding a service. We can also copy this phase. So if you need to copy the entire phase, then you can, and it will bring over all the information. We can also delete all zero-value services from this phase, something I'm going to show in just a second as well. Let's choose to add a service. Let's add a couple. Let's say that we want to add an item here called coordination. We also want to add an item here called archiving, and let's say we're going to add an item called final art. Select to add those. and they have added in. Now, one thing I'll mention is that if you do want to reorder these items, let's say I want coordination near the top, on the far right, you have two arrows pointing up and down. Notice the tooltip. Hovering over those arrows allows us to see that we can select this and drag it and drop it into any order that we want. So coordination, maybe we want to be, just below production, for example. Now let's say that, final art, we want to put in a value, and we're going to put in another, let's say, 10 hours against final art. However, archiving and coordination, after further review, we don't need those items. We're not going to have any values against them. And furthermore, we do not want them available to be tracked against. This is important because if you have a structure, a phase and service structure that may include many different items to be tracked against or to be used in the creation of an estimate, you may not always need all of those items in every particular case. It's important to get rid of them because you don't want your staff to accidentally go ahead and track time against them when really their time should have been going somewhere else. So while coordination and archiving actually aren't affecting the value of our estimates, since we have not entered any values against them, we still don't want them there. We don't want people to accidentally put time against them. So as opposed to deleting them one by one, all I need to do is click on this $0 value icon at the top. Selecting that marks everything with a 0 value for deletion, anything you haven't entered data for. This is particularly handy if you have a couple phases with a very large amount of services and you just want to put in values against the one that you need and get rid of the ones that you don't. When I click Save, they will go away, which we'll see in just a second. We then have our example of our external expense, printing. Now the information that you provide here is going to turn into your purchase order. It's actually a new feature that we've released recently where you can turn the item from your estimate directly into a purchase order without having to go any kind of long way around. You'll notice here that we have a cost and a percentage markup. The percentage markup is filled in based on the client's rate category. But let's say that this printing charge is going to have a cost of, let's say, $2,000. And we're going to apply a markup of, in this case, let's say 25%. We can add in our own custom markup if we wish. Now, one thing I'd like to mention as well is discounts. I do get this question quite a bit. If you want to represent a discount and actually show the discount on the estimate, you could do that as an entirely separate phase or an entirely or service within a phase. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this, and then we'll add a discount. Select Save. It's going to ask me, do you want to delete the following items? Coordination and archiving? Yes, I do. Submit. Our estimate is now created, and it's also cleaned up. Coordination and archiving are no longer here. Now let's say that we want to add a discount. Oftentimes the discount is best represented in a phase, and what we might do is actually add in an entire new phase and label it as a discount. So up at the top here, I have a button that says Add Phase. Select that. You may not need to have an item that's labeled discount right away. We can really select any phase. Let's say Creative Services, add it in, and then simply label that item as a discount. We can then enter a negative value into our override field. Let's say our budget for this was $12,500. So let's say we're going to give a discount of $2,050. So we can enter our discount, and that will show up on your client-facing printout if you should choose it to do so. Select Save, and our estimate is now created. Now at this point, what I want to talk towards is looking at the revenue schedule and how the revenue schedules are created. A minute ago, we looked at the month to close and the close probability, and that's really the simplest way of looking at reporting on what is the potential work coming down the pipeline. But we do have a method that's a bit more advanced. We have an item here called revenue schedule. What the revenue schedule allows for you to do is enter in dates that you expect billing to occur and the amount of billing that is going to happen. So what we can do here is actually add in a revenue schedule line item. We're going to look at that in just a second, but one thing that I want to show is the ability to auto revenue forecast. When you're looking at your phase in service, if you want to get a bit of a shortcut or head start on your revenue schedule, down at the bottom we have a button that says auto revenue forecast. What will happen is if you select this, it's going to take 100% of the value of the estimate, in this case $12,500. It's going to then drop that as a single line item on your revenue schedule on the due date of the job. So the delivery date in this particular item is December 21st. So I picked up December 21st, and I dropped in $2,500 in external expenses, $50 in internal expenses, and $9,950 in internal services. This will then flow into our revenue schedule. A lot of our clients that bill on milestones may break this up into different billings that are going to be occurring. So we might say, on December 1st, we're going to be having another billing that's going to be occurring, and we're going to be billing for, let's say, $25 of internal expenses. And let's say that we're going to be billing, let's say, $4,500 of our internal services. Now you'll notice here that we have a difference here where it's showing us that we're over by $4,500. So let's just take this out so that we have $5,550, which I believe would be the difference there. And actually, one of the things that you'll notice here is that that simple math is actually shown, and it's actually telling me the difference. So when you hover over, it's letting us know that we have a difference of $100. So I'm just going to take this out so that we're now matching up to the value of our internal services. Now that's the basics of the revenue schedule, and this will flow into your forecast report. It allows you to look into the future and see what kind of revenue are you expecting 3 months out, 6 months out, 9 months out. There is also a bit of an approval process on this. You may have one individual that submits the revenue schedule, whereas yet another individual will then approve it. That's really the basics of creating the estimate from scratch. Now, one thing that I want to touch on really quickly before we go into tracking and managing different revisions is creating an estimate from a template. Let's say that we want, let's say that we have a brief created, and we want to then go ahead and select from an existing template that we may have in the system, and we want to use that template to create our new estimate. Let's select our brief here. Let's go into our NA winter brochure. I'm actually going to, I'm actually just going to quickly get rid of our estimate here. So we have our NA winter brochure. Now let's say we've created this brief, and we want to go ahead and create an estimate, but we don't want to go through the entire process that we just went through. We don't want to have to go through creating the estimate from scratch. Perhaps we already have a template in the system that has the information we need and has the phase and service structure, maybe even as far as the descriptions and the staff people that will be doing the work. We want to select that estimate, copy it, and use it as our new instance. What I'll do is, from our brief details page or from anywhere, as opposed to selecting add estimates, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do an estimate find. I'm going to select find estimates. I'm going to choose to say show me all of my templates. Now we're going to touch a bit more on the creation of the templates in just a bit, but I'm going to say show me all of my templates that have a type of brochure. Select find, and I can see now that I have my brochure template. Select my brochure template, and that brings us to the details page of the template for this particular estimate. Now I can review this. If this looks as though this is the item that we want, then up at the top here in our action buttons, I'll select copy estimate. That brings us to our estimate copy page, and it pulls all the details from our template, including the name, the type, and the company. So we're going to want to change our company. Let's say in this case it's for our North Shore Auto Group. Perhaps we want to rename the item as well, brochure for Auto Group. Choose our contact, and then you'll notice that the brief field has a magnifying glass. It's letting us know it's an intelligent field. We can click on the magnifying glass to see a list of all of our open briefs for this particular client. Select my NA Winter brochure, and it fills in for us. You can also, again, type in our short form. So if you remember the name, in this case we're relating this to our NA Winter brochure, it will fill in automatically. So what we're doing is we're selecting our existing brief that we created a minute ago, but we're creating our estimate from a template. Perhaps we'll update the description, enter our due date, click Submit, and what you'll find is that our phase and our service structure is already filled in. Descriptions would exist if you do want your template to have descriptions. We can, of course, update those. And then you'll notice that the hours have filled in as well. If in our template we had gone as far as to select staff individuals, then they would fill in as well. Now let's touch on the topic of revisions. One thing I want to mention is that if you put the estimate into an approved state, that means that you will not be able to make edits or adjustments unless you create a revision. Let's say we approve this estimate. The estimate is now approved, and it goes into non-editable mode. You'll notice now that if I want to make any adjustments, it no longer just says Edit Phases and Services. It now says Revise and Edit Phases and Services. If I select this, it's going to ask me, do you want to create a revision of this item? Revise. We now have our new version. Notice up at the top, it says Client Revision R1. It's letting us know it's the first revision. Each revision that you add will then add a new number to this particular item. So up at the top, I can create another revision if I want to. Now, an important thing to mention is that you may not want this to show up for your client. Let's say we want to print out our client-facing version. Up at the top right-hand corner, I'm going to select Print for Client. That's going to give us our client-facing version. Now, of course, your estimate may look significantly different than ours. And this will have the print parameters that you specify. But you'll notice here that it's saying Estimate 30299 R2, second round. Now, you may not want your client to know that you went through a couple rounds of revision internally before you supplied them with the estimate. So we want to get rid of that. We would simply go back into our estimates, click on Edit Details. It's going to ask you if you want to submit your phases and services. If your phases and services are in open and editable mode, it'll ask you to submit them and then open up the top details for edit. You'll notice it says Client Revision R2. We can then take out this number. It still is the second round, and you'll be able to manage that internally. But now when you print off your client-facing version, one thing I'll mention is that when we are submitting an estimate that had been previously approved, it'll ask you, do you want to set it to approved again? In this case, let's say that we don't. And now when we reprint our client-facing version, you'll notice that the revision is no longer showing. This allows you to track as many different versions and revisions internally without having your client see that information on the client-facing version. So, we've covered the creation of briefs and the creation of estimates, and we've looked at the ability to put in values on estimates such as a month close and a close probability. And now what I'd like to move to is reporting and searching on those estimates and those briefs. So let's say that we're going to do a search and we want to see estimates that are currently in review, and we want to maybe pull a report on those. What I might do is simply hover over estimates and select Find Estimate. That brings me to my estimate find page. And there are a lot of different fields that you can search from here. And a couple that you'll find are month close and close probability. And what this might allow us to do is say, I want to see all the estimates that are in review or maybe submitted. Typically submitted, I do highly recommend that when you are submitting an estimate to a client that you do change that item to submitted. It's important to remind your account executives and your staff people that are submitting estimates that this will really affect the reporting of those items. So it's important to mark items as submitted when you are submitting them to your client. Well, let's say submitted and in review. And let's put in a close probability. Let's say maybe 50% to close. I'll put in 0.50. I may further narrow this down by a month to close. Well, let's keep it open. Let's say all in review are submitted, 50% to close. Select find, and that produces the results of our search. So we can see that there are 7 estimates currently in review or submitted that are 50% to close. We can see the client it's for, name of the estimate, the type, the close probability, the date of the estimates, the month to close, in other words, the month that the account executive is expecting the estimate to be approved, and then the total value. Up at the top, you can then print this off into a simple PDF of the information that you're looking at, export the data to an Excel, or you can print off an estimate list by client report. What this is going to do is give you an overview of all the estimates in your list, organized by clients, the name of the estimate, the status, the account executive, the due date of the projected project, the description, estimated hours. We then have the dollar values in internal services, internal expenses, and external expenses, and then the total value currently in estimation for each client. And of course, the report would have your own logo and branding to it as opposed to ours. Very useful report, really easy for your account executives to enter this data. Very beneficial for them as well by putting in a month to close and a close probability. It allows them to pull up the information as well and search on this, and it's not very labor intensive to include that information. So if we want to just take a look at searching and reporting on briefs, really simple. It's a very similar process. We're simply doing a brief find, and we might say, I want to see all the briefs that maybe do not have open jobs. You'll notice the job status. I may narrow this down by any other information that we say here, perhaps account executive, perhaps by budget or by compensation. We may also put in, say, a creation date range. I want to see all the briefs that are created between the last, let's say, 6 weeks to today that have jobs that are either unopened or, let's say, maybe opened. Select find. Well, of course, that date range is not going to work for me there. I meant to say 6 weeks ago to today. Select find, and that produces the results of our search, which you can then produce again into a PDF or export to an Excel. Now, I want to touch really quickly on the revenue forecast reports before we go into the creation of the templates. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the revenue forecast report going over the information that it's providing. I'm just going to show where to access the information or the report that is pulling from the revenue schedule. So up at the top in our report section, you'll find an area here called Analyze. I believe it's under Analyze. We've actually renamed some of these categories recently, so I'm actually just kind of brushing up on them a little bit myself. It actually may be under Plan. Here we are. So under the Plan tab in our report section, you'll notice a report called Revenue Forecast. This revenue forecast is pulling from the revenue schedule that you enter on your estimates. It's a very robust report. It produces into an Excel. It allows you to provide a lot of different filters: clients, lead creatives, account executives, client leads. You can choose how far into the future you want to forecast for, organize this by the statuses of the estimates, and then narrow it down by certain types. This will then produce into an Excel and give you a very robust forecast report. that's giving you an overview of the revenue that you can expect out into the future, December, January, February, March, as far out as you told the report to go for each job. And you're then able to review later on when the jobs are open and compare the amount that you're billing compared to what your revenue schedule originally dictated. So very powerful report, very robust report, and I do recommend investigating this and looking at the information that it's providing. So I know that we're running up pretty close onto the 45-minute mark. So I want to jump into the creation of templates and for both briefs and estimates. Let's look at the creation of estimate templates first. It's actually really simple. What we're doing is typically copying an existing item or creating an item for the purpose of a template. Really, what we often recommend is to use a previous job as the template for a new estimate. Let's say we look at our webinar brochure. We look at this and we say, this is really close to what we'd want to use for another brochure in the future. It has the roles filled in as we need them, the hours are correct, perhaps even descriptions that we want to use again. So what we can do here is select to copy this estimate. We're then going to turn it into a template. I'm going to do that by calling a template. So I might say templates for brochure. Provide more detail in the name if you wish. Select your appropriate type. And it's important to put your own company as the company field. You don't want this showing up for any clients. You want it to be under your own company. You'll have your own company as an office in the system. You want to select your own company. And typically you'd want to select yourself as the estimate contact. The account executive, maybe not so much, but yourself as the estimate contact. You can actually leave that blank if you prefer. But what this does is it puts this as a new template within your own company that you can then search for based on the word template and the word type, and the type of brochure or any other type. And then you can then use that item to create your new estimate similar to how we did earlier on. Click Submit here. We now have our new template created. It's for our own internal company, and it's now a brochure template with all the information that we provided. Now, if you want to start off by creating an estimate template, perhaps you don't want to copy an existing item, you want to create a template from scratch, the process is really simple. All you're doing is you're adding an estimate for your own internal company. You're building it from scratch, but when you start off, you simply name it templates, choose the appropriate type, and relate it to your own internal company. So now let's look at the creation of the brief templates. The creation of the brief templates is actually surprisingly easy for the amount of flexibility that it offers. Up at the top right-hand corner, in the admin section, we have an area here called Features. We have an area here called Brief Types. One thing I'll mention is that if you ever look at the admin section, and you're looking for an area, and you're not seeing a certain section, it may be because you don't have the privilege or the access level to do so. If that's ever the case, speak with your systems administrator at your company, your main function point contact, and they'll be able to get you the appropriate privilege. If you are the main contact, you'll simply open up your own staff details page under staff management, and then adjust your privileges. But I'm going to open up brief types, and this will give us a list of our brief types. And again, the brief types typically match up to the job types in the system. I'm going to select our brochure, and that will bring us to our brochure template creation. Now this actually provides some really good instruction. You'll notice the instruction on the right-hand side, so I recommend reading over this as you're creating these items. But the creation is really simple. You'll notice that we have a list of each question. So when we were filling out the brief, we had a question that was called, what is the big picture? It was a text area, it was a required field, and had a comment of project information, goals, measurable objectives. Let's say that we wanted to add a new a new field into this. We wanted to be a drop-down, and we wanted to say something like, what is the target audience? All I need to do is select Add Question, adds a new question. I might say what is the target audience. And let's say I want this to be a drop-down. So what I'll do is I'll simply select drop-down from the field type. I'll then enter the values of the drop-down. Let's say I want it to be government, let's say commercial, residential. These are going to be the values of my drop-down. If I want to have a comment on the field, I can enter a comment here. Now, if we want to preview what this field is going to look like and what our brief is going to look like, up at the top, you can choose to view the form. I always recommend saving your changes, always just good practice, and we'll then select to view our form. And you'll notice now that we now have a new field that says, what is the target audience? It's a drop-down, and we can then select from the drop-down. And that's really the basics of creating the brief. It provides really good instruction. And if you do want to create multiple pages, all you need to do is simply click Next, and it will bring you to the second page. And you'll notice here that towards the bottom, we have our area where we are uploading a file. We chose our file type of file. In other words, upload file into this field. Up at the top, I have a field called Group Duplication. Group duplication is asking you, do you want to duplicate the following fields? And how many fields do you want to duplicate? So if you have one file upload location, and you want to provide the ability for individuals to duplicate that file upload field, choose a group duplication, and they will then be able to duplicate the file upload. So when we're viewing our form, similar to what we were looking at earlier, you'll notice that we have choose a file and duplicate the next one field. So that's really the basics of creating the brief. One thing I want to mention really quickly about the brief types and the creation of them is that you may choose to allow your clients to fill these briefs out in the form of a work request from the client portal. It's not really the topic that we were meant to cover today. But with relation to the client portal, you'll notice that the first page when you get to creating a brief asks you, do you want to allow these questions from the client login? And do you want to allow the brief from the client login? It's referring to the two different pages. You may want to allow the first page of questions, but not the second page of the brief. You can choose to make this active, and this will then be available to the client via the client login. So that concludes everything that was on our agenda to cover today. I noticed that there are some questions. We do have another 10 minutes or so left, and I just want to see if I can get to as many of these questions as I can. And my time is not really filled up right now, so I'll be able to stay on the call a little bit afterwards. If people would like to stay on, then feel free to stay on.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark, for the presentation. Basically, I'm just going to launch a poll here. So for everyone that's in the call, just to give us an idea, how do you, like the webinar and how helpful was it? So I'm just going to put this up for, just a minute or so. So take your time to respond to that. And then we're going to go through, the questions. We have some questions here, Mark, so I'm going to pass that to you, and then we can address that as well.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So we have a question here that says, is it possible to estimate and calculate percentage complete against budgets while projects are progressing? Very good question. You definitely can. And once the job is open, you'll be able to calculate a percentage complete. So say, for example, if we were looking at, let's look at an existing job here. And let's pull up a good example. I'm going to pull up this job called GA Annual Report. Clicking on the name of the job is going to bring us directly to the details page. From the job details page, we can look at a tab called Financials. And what this allows us to view is an overview of the phase and the service structure. We can then see the estimated hours, the value of those hours, are actual hours to date, the value of that time in both a cost and a billable value, variance between your estimate and your actual, and then a comparison here between the value, or sorry, the amount that you've invoiced up to date, and then a comparison here between the value of your invoiced and the value of your actual. So we're able to see the variance in a dollar figure. So, what is the difference here between the value of your estimates and the value of your actual? And we see, where we've gone over or, where we may be under. Now, if we're wanting to view this, more as a percentage, let's say that we're wanting to pull up a list of jobs and see, what percentage complete each of those jobs may be. What we might do is say do a job find. And I might say, show me all of my active jobs. And then up at the top, I have a series of different action buttons, and one is the ability to produce a Gantt chart. The Gantt chart will give you a percentage completes, both with a color and a value, which we'll see here in just a second. See if I can just expand this a little bit here. So what this is showing us here is each job, the budgeted hours, actual hours, start and end date. We can then see percentage completes. 42% is in the green, 83% in the yellow, and then anything above 99% in the red. We can then view this for each specific task beneath the job as well if we should choose to do so.
We also have another question here, Mark. Can we produce estimates based simply on hourly rates or price ranges?
Okay, let me see here. So just to clear, okay, here we are. Produce estimates based simply on hourly rates or price ranges. We don't really have the ability to enter in a price range. There's a couple different options that you have for representing the different price options, but unfortunately we don't really have the ability to do a range. It is simply a value that we're entering. One thing that you may want to do is put in, say, option A and option B. So just a quick example here. Let's just get rid of a couple of these items. So let's say that I have a design and production phase here, and or let's use actually printing as a better example. Let's say that we want to have option A and option B. What I would do is I would simply copy this phase, and then I might have printing option A and option B. And let's say that option B is going to have a cost of $4,000. It's going to be marked up by only 15%. And then they have different quantities and values, and we can enter our quantities and values and whatnot in the description field. What this then allows us to do is produce our client-facing version. But before we do that, because we have different options and they are contributing to the total value of our estimates, we'd want to go into our print parameters and choose to turn off the total for the whole estimates. What this allows us to see here is an estimate where we have our creative services. We then have our print option A and print option B. So it's a bit of a workaround. It's not really a range, but it just, it's one way of putting in different options. And of course, you can choose to include the different services and their values beneath this if you'd like.
Excellent, Mark. Just gonna wait for a few more questions. If you guys have any other questions, please feel free to ask that in the questions module in the webinar. We still have a few more minutes here.
So let's. I'm going to pull up some of these other questions here. Let's see. Okay. Is there an easy way to copy an existing timeline that is not already a timeline template, then make that a template? Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to copy an existing timeline and make that into a timeline template. One thing that you can do is you can include dates in the estimates, which you can then copy into a new item and adjust the dates on the timeline. So, it's a bit of a workaround. If you're wanting an actual timeline template, the timeline template does need to be created in the admin section. And unfortunately, you can't copy an existing timeline to turn it into a template. One thing that you can do, however, is if your estimate includes dates, includes date information, which I believe the version I'm pulling up here does. So one thing that you can do is if your estimate includes dates, the dates themselves unfortunately won't update. It is something that we are looking at in the future on the estimates. But if we were to copy this item, let's say this was a template and we're copying it, and then we're then going to call this, let's just say, copied timeline example. Excuse my horrible typos. Maybe I'll adjust the type or the company or the contact, any of the other information. Click Submit. This gives us our estimate with dates that have been entered. So earlier we talked towards this, the creation of dates with the appropriate staff and or roles. What will happen is these dates will then flow into our timeline. So if we choose to create a timeline up at the top right-hand corner here in our action buttons, what will happen is it will pull the scope of work from our estimate into our timeline, including the dates. Now let's say that this estimate had dates that were a year old, and you want to then to update those. What I would do is up at the top here, simply hit Adjust Dates. Hit Adjust Dates, and let's say that this is actually something that's going to be starting. So let's say it was way out in the future. Let's say that this was the 2nd of April in 2012. Click to adjust the start dates, and it will move all the dates the appropriate amount of time. So it just allows you to have those date ranges already created in your estimates. You can then use those to populate a new timeline and update those dates. But unfortunately, we can't actually take this timeline and turn it into a timeline template. But it is something that we have heard about and something that is definitely definitely on our roadmap.
Excellent, Mark. Yeah, I think we have reached our limit here. Basically, what we'll do, we're going to post the questions and also the webinar. We recorded the webinar, so we're going to post on our support.functionpointwebsite.com. And thanks, everyone, for your time. And, it was a very good presentation, Mark. Thanks for taking the time for joining us as well today.
I just want to, really appreciate the conclusion there, Leo. I just want to really quickly answer one other question. I was just noticing that there was an item here that says, oftentimes we're requested to do an estimate revisions, which takes us through our R1, R2, et cetera. Is it possible to revert to a previous revision once the client makes a decision? In other words, they select a version that was 2 versions back. Can you reactivate it without recreating it? That's a really good question, really common question. It's something that you can definitely do. If we pull up our example that we were looking at earlier, let's see here. I believe this is the one that we had, the different versions. Here we are. So here's a case where we have an estimate where we have multiple versions. You'll notice in our tabbed inserts along the bottom, we have one called Revisions. Select Revisions. That's going to give us a list of our previous versions. This is going to show us all the versions, the values of those, and which one is currently active and which one is currently historical. Let's say the client comes back and they say, okay, well, I want R1, and that's the item I select. All you need to do is click on it. You'll notice it brings us to R1, and it's saying this is an historical estimate. Click here to go to the active estimate, or you can make this the active estimate. Select to make active, and that is now your active estimate. You don't need to go ahead and recreate that item. So I just wanted to answer that one question there.
For sure.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for for joining in today and all the really good questions. As Leo said, the webinar recording will be up and available. So, if you'd like to share it, then you definitely can.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you all.